here's what we're doing. This is a book club. So the premise is that you have the book, The Four Conversations, and you've read the book, or at least the chapter that we're talking about. And if you haven't, just get it and read it for next time. Um, we will be having Blair answer questions. So he's going to do a very brief overview of the chapter. And this week we're focusing on, well, the section, the qualifying conversation. So Blair will do a thing, then we'll take your questions. And in fact, you can start posting your questions anytime. Here's what I'd like you to do. There's a lot of people attending this live. So we're going to differentiate between the chat, which people are using already, great, and the Q&A tab. So if you could, please try to post your questions in the Q&A tab. That'll allow me to keep track of them and make sure Blair can answer them. But let's get the chat going and keep it lively. We love the way people interact with each other and with us in the chat. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. You can post in the chat right now. Here's the question of the day. Do you, yes or no, do you listen to the Two Bobs podcast? And if you do, if you don't, fine, we forgive you. Maybe you should start. But if you do, what was your favorite episode or favorite topic? So let's hear from you about the Two Bobs podcast. Yes or no, you listen. And if you do, what's your favorite topic? All right, great.
It appears to be raining everywhere in the world.
Yes, we've got some podcast junkies here. Big fans. Great. Thank you, Kathleen and everyone. All right, Blair, the qualifying conversation. Let's get right into it. This really is at some level where the concepts that you're laying out in the book, where the rubber meets the road. Because doing the conversation well, doing it from the expert position sets up everything else. And failing to do it kind of weakens everything to follow. So
Yeah.
get us set up for this, the qualifying conversation.
Yeah, I think qualifying of the four conversations, qualifying is everybody kind of intuits the idea of what it means to qualify somebody. Um, Shout out to Ben Scoggins for this photo that he's allowed me to use. Chapter 2, the qualifying conversation. It is the second conversation in our series of four conversations based on the book. So, like Adrian said, this is book club. You've all read the book, or at least you have the book and you're following along. This works best. I don't go deep into the principles of the frameworks. I just review them at a high level and then take your questions. So the idea is that I understand this is how book clubs work. You read the book and then we have a discussion about it. Hey, I want to ask you all a favor, if you don't mind. If you have read the book, would you do me a favor, please, and leave me a review on Amazon? I would really appreciate it. 5 stars are clearly better than four or the other, but just an honest review of what you thought of the book. I would be deeply grateful. Thank you very much. So, the four conversations. Let's just do a little primer or primer, depending on where you are in the world, on the four conversations. What is this book about? It's a model. A model is a view of the world. It reduces it simplifies complexity. All models are wrong, some are useful. Our model is we view the sale as a series of four linear and discrete conversations. Each linear, one follows the other neatly, and they're discretely packaged. Now, reality is not always, this isn't always the case in reality. In fact, I would say it's rarely the case in reality. And still, it can be helpful to us to think of the sale as a series of four linear and discrete conversations. So each conversation has its own objective. Each is distinct, each has its own objective, each has a framework for navigating to that objective. And throughout the four conversations, there are these principles that you embody, and they're really the principles of how any expert should behave. And you embody these ideas or principles as you're using the framework to navigate to a conversation's objective. So at any point in the sale, you simply stop and ask yourself, wait a minute, where am I? What conversation is this? Okay, this is the qualifying conversation. All right, what's my goal in the qualifying conversation? It's not to keep the client on the call as long as possible or to have the meeting go as long as possible, although that's how I behaved for the first few years of my career. Every conversation has its own goal or unique objective, and the qualifying conversation is the vetting conversation, where our objective is to vet the lead to see if there's an opportunity here to determine the next steps. So I'm reminded of what my objective is. Oh, this is the vetting conversation. And that should tell me something. I should be in discernment mode. This is different from the three subsequent conversations, from the two subsequent conversations, in that our tone is slightly different. Okay, I'm in vetting mode. My objective is to vet the lead. What framework do I use? I use the qualifying conversation framework. And then while I'm using the framework, I embody the principles. And I suspect we'll have a lot of conversation around principles on this chapter 2 of the Four Conversations book club. So, quick review of the four conversations. Last week, we covered the first conversation, the probative conversation, where your objective is to prove your expertise to the client and then move in their mind from this position of vendor, where you have very little power in the buy sell relationship, to the position of expert. So, you move from a vendor, a powerless vendor, to the expert. And there's a shift in power dynamics. We have a name for that shift. We call it the flip. The flip is the moment in time when you move from vendor to expert in the mind of the prospect. Now, I pointed out last week, most of you have seen this happen in real time. But the key to the probative conversation is that this is a conversation that happens without you present. This conversation is a conversation that happens through your agents of thought leadership and referrers. It's the act of reputation building through strategy, positioning, and lead generation, proving your expertise in the public, driving inbound inquiries with you already seen as the expert. So you've moved from vendor to expert before the first person to person conversation. And when the inbound inquiry comes in, you are already seen as the expert. You're already in what we call the power position. Now, that brings us to our second conversation, which we'll go deep into today. This is the first person to person conversation. It's the qualifying conversation, where your objective is to vet the lead. There's a lengthier version of this. We can break down, what does it mean to vet? What is a lead? But you're essentially, this is the vetting conversation. You're vetting the lead to see if there's an opportunity here to determine the next steps while maintaining the expert position. So that last part, the secondary objective of maintaining the high ground that we achieved through the probative conversation, that's key here. We want to make sure that we do not give up the high ground by suddenly showing up in the sale as a needy vendor. So we maintain the expert position. Now, implied in this secondary objective, again, and the secondary objective is consistent from here forward, implied in this is if the probative conversation hasn't happened and we haven't moved in the mind of the client from vendor to expert, then that becomes our secondary objective. So how do we do that? We do that by simply using the frameworks and embodying the principles. The understanding that the flip will happen at some point in time. And if it doesn't happen, we can still close the business from the position of vendor, but we will have we would have done so at a high cost of sale, a low profit margin, with us impairing our ability to do our best work. Doesn't mean we're not going to win. And lots of people have made a career out of winning business from the vendor position, but it's entirely different when you win from the expert position. So that's the qualifying conversation. That's what we're talking about today. Next week, we will cover the value conversation, where your objective is to determine the value that you might create and the amount of value that you might command in the form of fees while maintaining the expert position in the relationship. And then 2 weeks from now, we will cover the closing conversation, where your objective is to help the client select and commit to a path forward, again, while maintaining the expert position. Okay, that's the four conversations overview. Today is the qualifying conversation, in which we vet the lead while maintaining the expert position in the relationship. Now, throughout the book, there's this idea of frameworks and principles. So again, the framework is the tool that we use to navigate to a conversation's objective. This is a simple illustration of the qualifying conversation framework. It's a version of BANT. This is not rocket surgery. It's a budget, authority, need, time frame. We've got some differences in it, where others have need, we have desired future state. And I suspect we'll have some questions around desired future state because where others try to peel the onion of need, we go try to go to what the heart of what this human being wants. So that's the key framework. And as I've already said, the principles that are introduced here in the qualifying conversation are really the principles of how any expert should behave throughout the entire arc of the sale. There is one principle that's different here, and I don't cover it here. And the principle is, I've already spoken to this. Your tone is one of discernment here. It's discernment because you are vetting the client. And if you've had a probative conversation, if you've done all the hard work of strategy, positioning, and lead generation, and you've moved in the mind of the client from vendor to expert, then the client will have largely qualified you already. There will still be some questions that they will want uh, you to ask. They will still have some of their qualifying questions. But the most important thing about the qualifying conversation is this isn't you qualifying for the client. Ideally, you've done that through the hard work of the probative conversation. This is you qualifying the client. So I've written on this recently. David and I have recorded a podcast on it that hasn't dropped yet. Um, but the post is called There Is No Credentials Meeting. So, where a typical creative firm would think of a credentials meeting, you would think of this first conversation as the credentials meeting, where you show up and you communicate information to the client about how great you are because you are hoping to qualify, right? That's not the framework. The framework is the questions that you ask to see if this client qualifies to be one of your future clients. Excuse me. All right, so key principles. It starts with mindset first. I'm not going to go deep into these. I really do want to have a conversation about this. So it all begins with mindset. How do you rewire your mindset so that you are showing up like and behaving like the expert instead of the vendor? So we have a 4 sentence mantra. We call it the expert's mantra. And when Disney's lawyers aren't looking, we call it the Jedi mantra. But it's really the 4 sentences that you say to yourself. We can get into those if you have questions about the mantra. But it's just designed to reset you and move you out of needy vendor mode into expert mode. So it starts with your mindset. Second principle is this idea that selling is leading. And we say so right in one of the lines in the mantra. Um, so you need to see yourself. It's not, I've talked about this in other areas. It's not parenting. It's not you plastering that fake smile on your face, nodding yes. You need to see yourself as a leader in this moment. The sale is the sample. If you want to lead in the engagement, you will have to lead in the sale. And you don't overplay this idea, but you need to show up as the grown up, as the person in control, as the person with the framework to navigate this conversation. Say what you're thinking. You have a professional obligation to say what you're thinking. I would like that version of you to show up in the sale, not the needy salesperson who's making the mistake of thinking that you're in the customer service business where the customer is always right. You're in the expertise business, it's more likely that your customer is wrong. Not because your clients are idiots, but because they don't have the full picture, a third party perspective on their situation. Conversations instead of presentations. This is right out of the Win Without Pitching manifesto. The model is called the 4 conversations, and we mean it. Yes, the probative conversation is a bit of a construct for your reputation. It's the conversation that happens without you present. But from here forward, you are in conversation mode. You're not in presentation mode. You're not in persuasion mode. It's not your job to talk anybody into hiring you. It's your job to facilitate a series of conversations. Win the race to object. If there's an objection in the room, you put it on the table, ask the client to address it. Embrace silence. Anytime you raise an objection, say no, put an obstacle in front of the client, say a really big price. Learn to just shut up afterwards. This is the single biggest little thing that you can do to become a bit better salesperson. Quit filling the void with chatter. Leave space for information to come back to you. Excuse me. Last principle, it's okay to say no in air quotes. This is what you're trying to communicate to the client at all times. Hey, if the answer is no, I want to hear it. If you have an objection to anything that I've just said, if you don't see a fit, you have a concern about our ability to do this, I want you to say it. If the answer is no, I want to hear it. Everything about your demeanor should say to the client, if you're thinking no or you have a concern, you have an obligation to speak up. That can't happen if you go into presentation mode, can it? Back to conversations instead of presentations. I'm fond of saying you can present to people or you can be present to them. You can't do both. The frameworks, this is really the qualifying conversation framework, the second one. It's a version of BANT. It's a tool. I think of that as the toolbox, and it's the toolbox in which you organize your tools. Your tools are questions. The qualifying conversation framework is a framework of the questions that you will ask the client around desired future state, uh, decision makers and decision making process, time frame, budget, also context. So there's really 5 boxes there. So you know what the questions are that you want answered. You want to get answered in a qualifying conversation, and we do this in training. It's this is an area where practice is really important because you know what the questions are. You just need to bring yourself to ask the questions in a business-like manner, slightly clinical, slightly discerning. Right? I just have a few questions to ask, if you don't mind, and you start with your list of questions and get your questions answered. I'll stop there. There's so much we could talk about. Adrian, I'll hand it back to you. Where do you want to start?
Well, thank you everyone for the questions that you have put into the chat. Sorry, into the Q&A box. Um, you can continue to do that. Uh, let's just start. So there's a few people who have said, yes, soft skills are so important. We also strive for BANT in a qualifying conversation. Blair, you want to stop sharing your screen there, or do you want to leave those up? It's up to you. So there's a number of, so I ask people, listen, what are you really struggling with? Like what's going to be most helpful here is if you bring your real experience with this, or what's stopping you from getting real experience with this, uh, to the table so we can talk about it. Ryan asked a more general question. Ryan, I would ask you to give us your own answer to this, which was, when it comes to mindset, what are the most common challenges you, Blair, see most of us needing to work on and through to be recognized as the expert? And so, Ryan, back to you. You could say, what are you struggling with there? But Blair, where do you see people trip up with this?
You might be looking for a granular response to that, Ryan, but to me, I just see overall vendor-like behavior. That's the trip up. So how do you get out of overall vendor-like behavior? So there's the mantra that you can recite to yourself. I am the expert. I am the prize. I'm on a mission to help. I can only do that if you let me lead. All will not follow, and that's okay. So I'm focusing on 3 key things, and then I'm letting go of the outcome, and so I can focus on the process. So that's helpful. But I would say, just generally speaking, I'm fond of saying, if you want to get better at selling, 3 words: no sunk costs. No sunk, when you start to over invest in the sale, like there's a certain amount of research that it makes sense for you to do in advance of a conversation. I find most people go a little bit too far into the research. When you go too far into the research before a qualifying conversation, then you show up, they're already qualified in your mind. You're already really excited. You no longer ask the questions that you should be asking. You're no longer business-like. You're now this raving fan. You're so excited about it. You just go right into needy vendor mode. So I would say that's a general response. It's just the distinction between expert behavior and needy vendor behavior. Now, when people listen to me talk about that and they see I have kind of like I'm smiling on the inside right now, but you can't tell. Um, when they hear me talk about it and they imagine me doing this, I don't mean, you don't need to come across as serious as my natural demeanor. Um, You don't have to overplay this idea of discernment, but you should just be clinical and businesslike. Like you have a list of questions, get the answers to those questions.
Yeah, this is something that we'll talk about more next week, but this mode of being is very different between the qualifying conversation and the conversations you have in the sale once you've qualified someone in. So, this idea of discernment, really being professional, even working visibly from a framework. You don't have to hide this and pretend as if you just magically thought of these questions off the cuff. You can, even if it helps you, say, now, I typically walk through a series of questions, and I'm sure you'll have some questions for me, but let's just start with, and then get right into that. Um, in the vein of vendor like behavior, Rose asks, so I am the expert, I am the prize. Yes, but do you think offering a free strategy session to showcase my expertise is a good idea before making the pitch in the second conversation?
What pitch?
Yeah, what's the name of this company again, Jim?
Where um, at no point are you making a pitch. And I don't just mean that semantically. I really
Right.
mean that. And that we like so that's an answer to Ryan's question, right?
Yeah.
What's the biggest difference? We still think we're going in there auditioning. We're up on the stage auditioning. And I recognize that if you're a large New York ad agency or a large London ad agency dealing with the largest clients, there are certain and procurement, there are certain power dynamics where you have to take these principles and bend them to reality a little bit. But for the vast majority of you, it's really your biggest challenge, your biggest mental challenge is the idea that you still see yourself as a powerless vendor going into a pitch, right? So we only, we had less than an hour on the probative conversation last week. The probative conversation is it's the most different, but it also encompasses the most work. All the work that you have to do to get to this place, to get yourself to change the power dynamics. It happens through strategy, positioning, and lead generation over time, building reputation in the public over time. Um, Now I'm just rambling. So was there a specific the specific question?
Well, yeah, so I think Rose's, I mean, your point's very well taken. And Rose, I hope that answers some of what was behind the question. The specific question was, do a free strategy session, perhaps as part of the probative conversation before qualifying or before moving on with the sale.
Yeah, so a free strategy session as a lead magnet. Yeah, is there something you can do other than free? Like, can you do a free webinar like this? Can you do a free thing where you're giving your time away to a bunch of people where you can get some engagement? And then, maybe there's a free strategy session after that. I think you just have to, when you're leading with something free, you have to be careful. Now, we're trying to balance like the status of the expert, the high ground of the being seen as the expert, with the need to drive leads. So you do have to drive leads. So I don't dismiss that idea altogether of having a lead magnet of some kind or some kind of tripwire where you give something away for free. Um, so I wouldn't say don't do that. But again, am I getting to the specific of the specific ask?
Yeah, I think so. And really, for me, this is one of those things that bridges. There are several questions in this similar vein, bridging the probative conversation and the qualifying conversation. And what I would just point out here is if you feel like you need to prove something, first of all, you might want to look at that. But second of all, that's not qualifying. That's something else. So whatever you do before the qualifying conversation is what should demonstrate your expertise. If you're finding that you have to reaffirm it in the qualifying conversation, there might be some what is it you said, certain things yet undone, right? You haven't tackled some of this yet. Now, not a problem. If people have questions, you need to answer those questions. They need to vet you as well. That's the
Yeah.
other half of the qualifying conversation, which you did a whole session about, Blair, in the academy. We can talk about the academy in a few minutes. But here are some of the other questions that are in the same vein.
Ian's
John
got a really
asks,
interesting
go
question.
ahead.
Um, what if their desired future state is not something you believe they don't need or is misguided, or if it does not align with your values? There's so this is why we make the distinction between need and desired future state. So you imagine yourself in a qualifying conversation. The client comes to you self-diagnosed, self-prescribed, maybe even highly specified. I know what my problem is. I know what my solution is. Um, I know what the specs of my solution are. I just need a price. So that's a version of that's fairly common for a lot of you. You take the client's self-diagnosis, self-prescription. You say, "Great, thanks. Let me ask you a few questions." And then you use your qualifying conversation framework. So you use the you asked Ian about what if their desired future state is. Nah, there's that's different from their stated need. So the client has just given me a stated need. I look at it and I go, not likely. I don't say not likely. I don't say you're an idiot. I say, great, thanks for this. Lots of detail. Fantastic. Before we get into this, let me ask you a few questions. And then I get into my desired future state question. And so if you've read the book, you'll know that we think the key or the desired future state question that I love is the Dan Sullivan question. There's an entire book written on this question. It's only 84 pages. You can read it in less than 2 hours. And the question is basically putting the client into their desired future state and getting them to describe what success looks like. And when you do that, you will have them transcend the problem and the solution as they've stated it. So your question, Ian, is I understand what you're saying. The client comes to you and says, well, I need X. And you think, well, you don't need X. That's actually fairly common. But when you get them to transcend the problem and describe what success looks like in the future, you are now reserving the right to address that. Now, the way I would have you think about it is at some point, and we'll get to this in the value conversation, when you're setting up the closing conversation, you'll make this trade. Hey, if you let me come back with something more creative and expansive and elaborate that addresses the vision of success that you laid out, then I'll also price out what you asked for. And then I'll give you another option. So we're setting up the closing conversation where we will ask the client to select a path forward, select and commit to a path forward. So these conversations build on each other, but the key here is nobody's desired future state is ever wrong. That is simply what they want to be true in the future. Anytime anybody buys anything from you, they are buying a better version of themselves in the future. And you're trying to uncover what it is.
Yeah. And also, the desired future state is not just a single question. You may want to ask a few additional questions to flesh it out or understand it better or have them understand it better. You may say, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. If that were to happen, what would that mean for you? What would that mean for the firm? What would that mean for you personally in your own career aspirations? You can spend a bit of time there uncovering, as you said, Blair, what this real human being in conversation with you wants. And yes, you may actually find that some of what they want is, uh, that rare element unobtainium, right, which is out there. And so you may say, listen, so what I'd like to do is, I hear that you want that. We have some ways that help people get things like that. I need to ask you a few more questions to understand if we're going to be a good fit or not. Remember, what you're trying to do in this conversation is assess fit
Yeah.
while maintaining the expert position. So there's a couple things I want to bring in here that are very good. Joanna asked, I have a very loyal repeat buying client who, in meetings, repeatedly interrupts and talks over me. Ah, yes, the monstrous mansplainers. It's not that he's meaning to be rude. I think he's just slightly autistic. Fair enough. I'm aiming to introduce a new aspect of service or collaboration beyond our current design and strategy, but it's very difficult to convey the value moving into a new space with his demeanor, even with the backup of experts on my team. Any ideas how to help with this? I've had to raise my voice in the past just to be heard, and he does eventually shut up. Joanna, this sounds hard. Before I turn it over to you, Blair, I want to just note that and in the comments, and I don't know if this was a response to Joanna or to anyone else, but it's very good, says, what helps me is if I've done the research and believe they're a great client, and then I do a deal with myself. The deal is how they behave, how they answer my questions in the qualifying conversation will help me assess if this client is a good fit. So many times I've realized they're not a good fit because of the way they've dealt with the qualifying stage. So, two not exactly related, but resonant issues there. Blair, how do you deal with those difficult situations?
Yeah, so the first one was it Joanna's?
Yes, Joanna.
Um, yeah, that's so they're a long-standing client who buys lots of stuff from you.
Right.
So I think sometimes you're Joanna, you're probably very good at kind of letting the client talk when they want to talk. And you don't want to pick every battle, you don't want to die on every hill. But there are moments, it sounds like instead of trying to squeeze this into another meeting, you should ask specifically for a meeting to talk to him about this thing. And then that's where you would have to go into a little bit of presentation mode and you would just set it up in advance. All right, so the client agrees to meeting. State the purpose of the meeting is for us to share something with you to review. So I'm going to ask you to be quiet for about 10 or 15 minutes. Maybe have a pad of paper or a notebook, a laptop, and note your questions as I go because I want to speak to you for 10 minutes. So set up the dynamics where that you desire. Don't try to force it into another meeting. Get him to agree to a meeting expressly for this purpose, which is for you to share with him some new ways of, if I understand you correctly, some new ways that you create value for clients like his. It's going to require you to talk at him for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation. And then at the beginning of that meeting, just remind them of what the objective is and just say, I just want to ask your indulgence. Just let me get through about 10 minutes of this stuff. If you have questions, note them, and then we'll have a conversation at the end. So just kind of take control of this. Set up the meeting for the purpose, take control at the beginning of the meeting. Adrian, you probably have something to add to that. Anything you would add?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first thing is to just deepen that and kind of get with Joanna where she's coming from. These are human conversations with real human dynamics. And sometimes that's going to include, and I'm not saying this is the case with you, clearly you have an interpretation, a generous interpretation of this man's behavior. But you and others will find yourself in situations where there is no generous interpretation, where the person is trying to use a power relation to gain leverage on you, where they are behaving inappropriately sometimes, where they're just not cooperating with what you say. And this is what comes back to one of the core principles: say what you're thinking and do that diplomatically. But you may say, I'm not sure this is going to work if we're not able to communicate about some of these basic things. Or it seems to me like you're upset by the way I'm approaching this. Is that accurate? Or anything at all which sort of breaks the pattern of, well, I just need to go along with whatever they say because I need their money at the end of all of this, and make sure that you're able to keep that somewhat clinical, very professional demeanor to deal with whatever. And most of the time, thankfully, we don't have to deal with truly problematic behaviors, but sometimes we do.
Yeah. And again, these are conversations, and this is a key tenet, principle threaded throughout. The idea is that we want to stay in conversation mode. I see Victoria says, it looks like my question went unnoticed. Victoria, I apologize. There are dozens
No,
and
Victoria,
dozens.
I have it highlighted in green right here, and
Okay.
it's queued up next.
I'll hand it over to
Uh,
you.
Yeah. So Victoria and James have two versions of a similar question. And Victoria, sorry, it does take us some time to get through it all. Victoria's question: in qualifying conversations, how do you typically address the competitive aspect when a client's clearly evaluating multiple firms for the same project? In my experience, I've never had a single conversation where my firm was the only one being considered. James asks, what if you're having to adhere to a formal RFP process that doesn't allow for conversational dialogue prior to submitting a proposal? So, two
Yeah.
takes on a similar thing.
Yeah, let's take
Matt has a similar question as well about RFP. So let's talk
yeah.
about that.
Um, so if it's a competitive sale and you don't already know that, should find that out in the qualifying conversation. Should you behave any differently in terms of getting asking the questions that they get answers? No, but you do want to find out. Um, so how do you address the competitive aspect? You want to find out if so under decision maker and decision making process, the DM quadrant in the four quadrants. So we have context at the top, and then we have the four quadrants that are typically known as band, but we call them desired future state, decision maker. So under decision maker, and decision making process, you would ask questions like, I like the opening question of, tell me how your organization typically goes about hiring a firm like ours. And you suspect they're talking to others, but they haven't said so. You can ask directly. I don't like to ask that directly immediately, but at some point, if I sense it's a competitive situation, I would ask, are you required to get three bids? No, we're not required. But you're having conversations with others? Yes. Can you tell me who you're speaking to? No. Can you tell me more about the firms that you're speaking to so I can get a sense that's going to help me get a better sense of what it is that you're actually looking for? So I'm still driving. I'm still in control. I'm not threatened by this. You, the client, have information that I want. I'm being pretty direct about getting that information. Now, I think if I read between the lines on some of these questions, there's this like the question is like, how do you stand out from the client? How do you show up? That's not your job here. Your job is to use the framework to navigate to the objective, which is to vet the lead to see if there's a fit here. As part of the fit, you will uncover the decision-making process, and you might determine that there isn't a fit. So let's say you're a firm where you just absolutely, as a matter of policy, you will not reply to an RFP. You will not, and I'm not suggesting that you should adopt this policy, but I do know there are some firms that we've worked with have decided we are never responding to another RFP. We are never going in another competitive pitch. Hats off to you. It's not what I would recommend, but I understand the motivation for it. So if you uncover that, that now you have to deal with the objection. You would put the objection on the table, right? One of the principles, you raise the object. If there's an objection, the elephant in the room, the reason not to do business together, a gap between what the client wants and what they think you can get. Those are all versions of the objection or different ways to describe it. You put it on the table and ask them to address it. So in this case, it might be, hey, we don't typically respond to RFPs. And I really like that line, that set piece with the word typically. So I'm leaving the door open a crack. So the client said, yeah, there are three others and we're going to RFP on this. As soon as I heard that, I would say, we don't typically respond to RFPs. This is me embracing the next principle, embodying the next principle, which is embrace silence. I've just created an objection. Now I'm leaving space, silence, because I am really interested in the information that's coming back. And some of you, your sphincters are tightening, right? And I promise you, with practice, you're just a person with the framework, using a framework to navigate to an objective. And I had to deprogram myself from years of being in agencies where the mode was whip yourself into an excited childlike frenzy on like a kid on a sugar high, get so excited about it, you cannot possibly behave like a business person. That's the place I'd like you to get to. So I deliver the objection. We don't typically respond to RFPs, and I wait for the information that comes back. And it might be, oh, well, as a matter of policy, we have to. Well, We've got to get three bids. It's like it's part of our policy. I like there's no way we can do business together if you don't respond to this RFP. Well, now we're in a conversation. Like the client, it might be worse. The client might say, "Oh, well, too bad for you because I've got to do this," but that's okay because there are three other firms that are interested in this. What does that tell you? You've just uncovered that you are not, the flip has not happened. You are not seen as the expert. You are one in a sea of many. Your odds of winning, so four firms under consideration at this point, three others willing to play ball. Your odds of winning are not 1 in 4. They're closer to 1 in 8. I can't prove exactly what they are, but I always say it's 1/2n. If the flip hasn't happened, it's one over, you should assume it's 1/2n. So n being the number of firms under consideration, four firms, your odds of winning are 1 in 8. If the flip has happened, and you will know the flip has happened by asking for a concession, you say, well, we don't typically respond to an RFPs. And the client says, well, we're going to have to figure this out because I need you to respond to an RFP. I want to work with you, but I can't if you don't respond to the RFP. So if something like that happens and they grant you a behavioral concession to prove the words, I want to work with you, now your odds of winning are greater than 1 in 2. It's yours to lose. So this back to this idea of expert or vendor, back to the probative conversation. If you're not seen as the expert, you're seen as a vendor. We want to, through the probative conversation, all these things around strategy, positioning, and how you generate leads, how you prove your expertise in the market, the flip to happen to drive the inbound inquiry with you in the power position. So I'm building on lots of different principles here. I should just stop talking right there, Adrian, unless there's something, thread that you want me to close, a loop you want me to close.
No, it's good. And Victoria's added some clarifications in the Q&A. She says, I'm typically asking if they are talking to someone else and if yes, who, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not an RFP situation. We don't participate in pitches and competitive bids, typically when someone's reaching out or inquiring about the project. So it sounds like you've worked out for yourself what your red lines are and what your quote unquote policies are. And those policies are useful to invoke as policy, as Blair said, and I linked to the 10 set pieces episode of Two Bobs where it just lays this out. There's times when it's useful to say, as a matter of policy, we don't X. And that could be a policy that you decided earlier that day and scribbled on a post-it note. It doesn't matter. It's your policy. That changes the dynamic. All right. There are a lot of things here. Some of them go back to, well, let's do this. This is fun. So, two questions related to doing things in person uh, rather than on Zoom or
Yeah.
other ways. Uh, First, Lars says, I often find myself in a situation where conversation number one, or the possibility for it, takes place in the live meeting. How could I approach this? And just for fun, Pete Johnson from last week follows up and says, last week I asked, what do you do if you determine it's a no-go before the appetizers arrive at a dinner with the principals? Here's the update. We took your advice, vetted it ahead of the dinner. My question this week, how do you proceed after the qualifying conversation with two principals if it's very clear that they are not on the same page with
Oh
each
yeah.
other?
That's a
So
that
after one of the principals left the dinner, the other principal said, now we can have the real meeting. Red flag?
oh, huge. Well, red flag, but opportunity. Man, I love it when you're in a sale and there is not alignment on the other side of the table. It can be problematic when it's junior, senior, where it's like, hey, I got to get my boss on my boss doesn't think we should do this, doesn't see a problem, et cetera. That's more difficult. But if you get two principals in an organization, so two owners, and they're not aligned, and then one says to you afterwards, okay, now we can have the real conversation. That is it does not bode well for that organization, but it bodes really well for you. You should sell a diagnostic at this point. Like your position should be, okay, great. I appreciate that. Let's have that conversation. Okay, I appreciate that we've had this conversation. Thank you for sharing with me. The next thing we need to do is we need to get other principal on board. We need to get you guys aligned. The way I do that is we have this thing called an X. So you call it whatever you want. It's a diagnostic. A diagnostic, sorry, it's not a diagnostic. It's a needs
An
assessment,
assessment.
which is an unpaid diagnostic. And it's really just a questionnaire. It's like 8 to 15 questions. And you get both principals to answer in isolation and share the responses with you. And if they'll do that, you are driving from here forward. So if if they'll agree to respond to the questions, they share the answers with you, you can be in a meeting to talk about the answers. Now you have the two different visions or two different assessments of what the situation is in stark contrast, and you are the facilitator. You are the person without baggage who is relaying this information and then facilitating a conversation about how do we close this gap. So you do a needs assessment, you will find either perfect alignment, which tells you something. 95% of the time, you will find some level of misalignment. And that's where the opportunities are. And so, I mean, it's just it's such a fantastic opportunity to bring the organization into alignment. And if you are not already seen as the expert, I suspect you are. You will be after facilitating the meeting to talk about the needs assessment findings. It's a great opportunity.
There are several questions that go back to bridging the probative conversation. Some of them are even touching on lead gen. So I just want to name them here. We won't necessarily be able to dig too deeply into this. I invite you to go watch the previous session and then also on LinkedIn or other places your um, post your questions if we didn't answer them. So Tim says, I love the idea of no credentials, that the probative conversation handles all that before anyone speaks. So we don't have to do it in the meeting. In reality, I feel the pressure to sell the agency, to explain why we might be a great fit. And I feel if I skipped that, the prospect would wonder why. Uh, uh, Alyssa asks, conversely, if the client gets to the qualifying conversation and they're still not convinced that you're the expert, can you just say, Google me, and all your expertise that's online will show up? John asks, how do you avoid presenting when you work in an industry the client isn't familiar with? I work in sonic branding, which often demands a lot of education and explanation. So again, that's probative conversation,
Yeah.
your agents of thought leadership, etc. And then finally, an anonymous question. You mentioned the probative conversation is the reputation of an expert that you build over time, and it happens before the first ever face to face or face to camera conversation. You talk about a balanced lead generation plan, mix of long term status building activities and the more immediate one to one outreach. I'm wondering if it's possible to have the probative conversation in a live conversation. And Marcus asked a related question about how do you get in front of larger clients, lead generation. So every one of these things could be an hour long answer, but
Yeah, well, I can sew them all together here because there's a common theme. So first of all, if the probative conversation happens or it doesn't, right? And if you find yourself in a qualifying conversation where the probative conversation hasn't happened, then you're just you don't look for the probative conversation to happen. The moment has passed. You're now in a situation where, and that's fine. This happens, and the earlier you are in this model, the more it's going to happen. And after a few years, that will become the minority. If you do the hard work, that will become the minority. So you don't look for the probative conversation to happen in the qualifying conversation. You use the frameworks, embody the principles, and the flip should happen in time. You don't look to force it. Now, a lot of the other questions, the theme here was around qualifying for the client, and you want to go into sales mode. You don't need to go into sales mode. So you show up in the qualifying conversations with your framework. And you made the very good point, Adrian. You make the framework visible. You don't try to hide behind it or hide the fact that you're using a framework. You actually want to communicate, I'm prepared, I'm following a framework. So I have a few questions I'd like to ask if you don't mind. You go through your qualifying conversation framework, and then at the end of it, so you're assessing a fit, and you think and you would even say, I think that on the surface, this seems to be a pretty good fit here. Your area of need, it's what we do, whatever the criteria that make you think it's a good fit, without getting too excited just yet. You could say, I could see my team getting very excited about this. Um, you don't try to get it too excited. And then you would say, because it's obvious, the client's asking you questions, you would say, now I have the information I need. Surely there's some information that you need about us. What do you need to know about us on your end to see if there's a fit suitable enough for us to take a next step, whatever, and we can talk about next steps in a few in a minute. What do you need to know about us? And the client might say, well, thank you for letting me ask, because that they're not going to, but they, they're going to show up to this meeting, especially if the flip hasn't happened, with a whole bunch of information. They're going to ask you questions. So what you don't do is you don't have a framework for answering the questions, with a small exception. You simply let them ask the question. How long have you been in business? Answer it. Who are your big clients? Answer it. Don't show the logo wall. Don't show the slide. Don't go into presentation mode. Let them ask their questions. At some point, so let's say the sonic branding example. We've never done sonic branding before. I don't know anything about this. Like I don't even know if I need this. So help me out here. Like so, and there will be different versions of that question. But there are two things that you should be prepared to share. Number one, you should have a visual model of your codified way of working. And so at some point you would say, oh, in answer to a question about how this is going to work, you would say, I have a few slides on that. Would you mind if I share them with you? And then you would go into, um, I'm not going to do it here, but instead of going into full screen presentation mode, you keep it where the slide view, the presenter, sort of the slide sorter view is there, right? Don't go into full presentation mode the way I'm sharing my screen. Pull up, share your screen, pull up whatever your deck is, go to the slide, let them see the other slides, because they might say, hey, can you talk to me about that? I see that. Is that your logos of clients? Can you share that? But you go to the slide that says, here's how we work. And you walk them through your entire model. So generally speaking, your model is going to be 4 steps. It's usually, David and I joke about this all the time. It's usually the steps have this start with the same letter. It's usually D. Whatever it is, you have a codified way of working, and now you walk the client through. Here's how we diagnose. Here's what prescription looks like. Here's what initial application looks like. Here's what ongoing reapplication looks like. So that's the first thing that you should have, is a visual model. And that will answer so many questions. Beyond answering the questions, it will give the client the reassurance that they seek. And the second thing that you should have is case studies. In your case studies, at the highest level, the highest expression of case studies is what we call process framed case studies. Your case studies prove that you actually follow the model. Here's the diagnostic process. Here's what we found. Here's the strategy we recommended. Here's the initial application. Here's the ongoing reapplication. Right. And in the model and the case studies, the client should see themselves. They can try on what it's like to work with you. They will ask you a bunch of process questions. These are the two things that you should show, and they are related to each other. Your visual model of your codified way of working, and your case studies, ideally, that line up with that model, that prove that you actually work this way. And those two things, that's what you should be prepared to share. And if you have other things that, in a slide somewhere, and a client asks you a question, you can pull up a slide, but do not go into presentation mode. You can present to people, or you can be present to them. The client will invite you to go into presentation mode. You want deep in your creative soul to do nothing more than to hit play and go into presentation mode and have it all be all about you, and for you to go into convince mode. And I mean, short of therapy, you need to resist that moment.
So, Blair, we've got 5 minutes left of book club. I have a whole bunch of questions we didn't get to.
Yeah.
Uh, Melanie specifically asked about budget. What do you do when a client won't share the budget? John, Eric, and Todd had questions about decision makers. How do you navigate getting access to the ones who aren't there, or if you're dealing with a junior person, et cetera? And then there was two questions about, well, what happens next. Specifically, let's say at the end of a call, the prospect requests a proposal, but it just feels like a polite way for them to end the conversation without a real intent to move forward. And then Wolfgang asked, how do you keep the expert position when the sale stalls, especially with larger clients? So we can't answer all of these here. We don't have time. Each one deserves a thoughtful answer. And
These
you've got some things to
these
say to
sessions
end
aren't
up.
long
So
enough, are they?
yeah.
But if I'm honest, I mean that's why we do have the win without pitching workshop. So that these are all great questions. I mean, and there are answers to all of them. What do you do when the client won't share the budget? It's not the end of the world. I do like to have fun with that one. So I would say, okay, so you have a budget, but you don't want to share it with me because you're afraid I'll spend it? Smile. So, but there's, I mean, every one of these questions, there are multiple good answers to it. So I feel
Well,
for
let's
you.
do this.
Yeah.
Why don't we end, Blair, with, because I know you got a couple of things you want to let people know are coming up, but let me first ask, uh, we do cover these things in the workshop. People have the book. The contents of the book are also the contents of the workshop. What's the benefit of actually doing live training with us as opposed to just simply reading the book?
Well, it's two things. Number one is practicing, and number two is getting the answers to all of the questions begged, right? But the real value is practicing. I don't remember if I said this last week, but previous to the book, we spent a lot of the workshop downloading information to people. Now we have them review some stuff in the academy ahead of time. And then most of the 12 hours of the workshop is just practicing the conversation. So you practice, you get some more information, you get some coach feedback, you practice again. That's the value of it. There's a lot here. I mean, it is a little bit of a crime to spend an hour on each of these conversations because we could spend a day on each of these conversations. So
Yeah.
I'll just
Now, you mentioned
summarize.
the academy before you get to your final slides. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, so the academy is we took our client Slack channel after you go through training, you're in this community, and we blended it with our LMS learning management system. It's a white labeled version of Circle. There's a Win Without Pitching app. I blog in there. It's like everything all the content I've ever created is in there. Discussions are in there, tools are in there, your training materials are in there. Um, Monthly coaching is in there, monthly guest speakers are in there. It's available to people who've been through training. So it's another reason to go through the workshop. And I'll talk about the workshop in a minute here, but let me just summarize. What does qualifying conversation mastery look like? It's actually pretty simple. This isn't difficult. Um, you complete your ideal client profile. So you need to know who is a good client and who isn't, and who do you want to do business with and who do you not want to do business with. What are the red flags? Identify these things. Out of that come your qualifying conversation questions. And then in some of your organizations, you have to make a decision around who is going to qualify. So you have to sign qualifying responsibility. In some of your firms, it'll just be people at a certain level. Sometimes it's centralized. And then this last point here is I wish I could wave my magic wand and have you all do this. You should record these qualifying conversations. They're all happening on Zoom. You all have AI assistants. You should record and analyze them and review them with a team member. That should be a matter of policy. We don't do that in training. We have the conversations live. It's something we do as part of our coaching with people who want coaching after training. So workshops coming up. Again, the online one, it says July 7th to 11th. It's actually 7th to 10th or 8th to 11th, depending on where you are in the world. This one is being done for an Asia Pacific friendly time zone. So it happens from 5 to 8 p.m. in New York, from 2 to 5 p.m. in Caslo or Vancouver or Los Angeles, 7 to 10 a.m. the next day in Sydney, 9 to 12 noon in New Zealand. We do this once a year. We move the time of this one. So if you're in Europe, I'm sorry, this one doesn't work for you unless you want to get up in the middle of the night. We do have two in real life workshops, Buenos Aires, July 1st and 2nd. That one's in Spanish. It's also priced for the LATAM market. And we have one in London, July 9th and 10th. So that's where you get the rest of your questions answered. That's where you get the practice. I mean, it's the workshop is where the light goes on. You read the book and you understand it intellectually, but you have these questions, um, and you get the answers to the questions really through coached practice. That's it in a nutshell. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. I apologize that we went a minute long. Next week, we're going to do the value conversation. Adrian, I think I'll commit to sticking around a little bit longer next week because I'm feeling bad that there's so many really good questions. So I'll try to stick around a bit longer. If people want to stick around, we'll go a little bit longer.
So
That,
let next week join us for the after party. And thank you, Blair. Thank you, everyone. The value conversation. If you haven't signed up for book club, the link is here on the screen. If you just stumbled across this somewhere, wwp.tv/book club should take you to register for the Zoom webinars. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions. And thank you for the creative and wonderful work you're doing in the world. Take care.